Hello, this is Dr. Glassbrenner from George Mason University, and in this video, we will discuss the current state of reproducibility in science. Reproducibility, also known as replication, is an important concept in science. To understand why, let's recall the key point from our review of the scientific method, which was creating a hypothesis and then collecting evidence to test it out. Remember that empirical observations constitute evidence, that we compare a hypothesis with the outcomes of the natural world, and that a hypothesis should be testable by anyone. Implicit in these statements is the concept of reproducibility, meaning that if we follow the same procedures as someone else under the same conditions and with the same equipment, we should get the same result. If this were not true, then scientific results would be relative and unreliable, and we would not be able to incrementally expand and build upon our knowledge of the world. While this idea comes out of the principles of the scientific method, it's worth considering whether scientists actually spend much, if any, time trying to replicate experiments. The journal Nature has been following developments regarding reproducibility in science for several years now, and as part of their coverage, they surveyed approximately 1,500 scientists in 2016 about this topic. The following is a summary of some of the responses they received. Before we continue, it is worth noting that the survey was informal, and the sample was not random, as a link to take the survey was sent out to their readership and was also advertised on affiliated websites and social media outlets as being, quote, about reproducibility, end quote. Similar to what we discussed last time, this may mean the results are biased, which you should keep in mind. One of the questions asks whether or not the respondents established procedures for reproducibility. While a majority of the respondents report having procedures in place at their labs, about a third of respondents do not, and another third only implemented them within the last 5 years. Taken at face value, this would mean a large minority of experiments have never been replicated because they've only been attempted once. How could this happen? In practice, the scientific ideal of reproducibility is sometimes easier said than done, and there are many reasons why. Those reasons include the following: a lack of funding for replication studies, as funding sources that provide grants are focused on promoting new research, not duplicating prior results. A lack of data sharing, which can be benign, such as the researchers not archiving their data in a standardized format or losing it to a hard drive failure. Or it can be protective, which can happen if a research team collects a rich data set which they plan to mine for results over the course of several projects. Or it could be, in rare instances, unethical, if the researcher engaged in data fabrication or poor analysis techniques and he or she wants to avoid getting caught. There's a lack of interest in replicating certain experiments, if the result isn't unexpected or groundbreaking. Then there's the historical problem that top-tier journals did not publish replication studies, reducing the incentive to try. The problem of vague methods is another issue, as it's not uncommon to find a paper where the methods section isn't long enough or detailed enough for you to be able to try to replicate the study. This occurs because of length constraints, which can be very strict, and this is not a complete list. Returning to the survey, the respondents also provided reasons on why they think this happens. You'll see in these summaries several items that are similar to the ones that we just discussed. But there is an additional one that I did not mention, which is, quote, low statistical power or poor analysis, end quote. A better understanding of statistics is cited by many respondents as a factor that would help with boosting reproducibility. We will revisit this idea later in the course as we learn more about how to use statistical tools from a computational point of view. Now for some concrete examples illustrating why it's important that we think about ways to encourage reproducible research and that this isn't just an abstract concern. First, returning to the Nature survey one last time, we see that a substantial majority of respondents have failed to reproduce at least one experiment, and many have failed to reproduce their own work. On the other hand, only a small proportion of these respondents have attempted to publish a replication study, but among those that tried, many were able to find a journal that would publish their results. It seems that at least one of the barriers to encouraging replication studies, finding a journal to publish it, may not be as difficult as once thought. In fact, if the scale of the effort is large enough, even a top-tier journal like Science may publish the replication study. That is what happened with the reproducibility project led by researcher Brian Nosek of the University of Virginia. He, along with many other colleagues, sought to replicate 100 different psychology studies that were all published in 2008. The project pulled these studies from 3 different psychology journals to see if they could get the same results as the initial findings. Only 36.1% of the studies were replicated. While these kinds of replication issues had been pointed out years before this effort took place, this was much more systematic and comprehensive, and difficult to ignore or dismiss. Let's now consider a few recent and well-known cases where there were problems with replication. In December 2014, authors Michael LaCour and Donald Green published a paper claiming that door-to-door canvassers can change people's opinions about gay marriage. Just 5 months later, the paper was retracted. The Science editor-in-chief Marcia McNutt stated the reasons for the retraction, which included the original survey data not being made available for the independent reproduction of results, the incentives used to encourage survey responses were misrepresented, and the sponsorship statement regarding funding sources was found to be false. While these are the official reasons, there was a lot of outside pressure on Science to retract the paper. The urgency was due in part to the widespread media attention that this paper received shortly after its publication, which included a full segment on the radio show This American Life, along with articles in outlets with broad readerships, such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Science Friday, Vox, and the Huffington Post. While it's not in the official list of reasons, the pressure to retract the paper began because of a failed replication attempt. 2 Berkeley graduate students were interested in the study and tried to replicate it, but were not successful. After closer analysis, they quickly discovered that the data must have been faked. Here's another example. An influential economics paper by authors Reinhart and Rogoff titled Growth in a Time of Debt was published in the American Economic Review in 2010, which argued that when a country's GDP to debt ratio reaches 90%, its GDP growth is cut almost in half. This finding was cited as evidence for implementing austerity measures in many countries after the 2008 financial crisis. Reinhart and Rogoff's dataset and analysis were not made public at the time of their paper's publication. Just like in the LaCour example, a graduate student became interested in the study and wanted to replicate the results. T. Herndon, a graduate student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, used publicly available country spreadsheet data in his replication attempt and failed to get the same result. Wanting to understand why the results were different, T. Herndon wrote to Reinhart and Rogoff asking for their dataset, and to their credit, they obliged. After receiving the data and analysis, T. Herndon, now working with professors M. Ash and R. Pollan, found several issues and published a critique. The criticisms were that 1. The Reinhart and Rogoff study contained selective exclusion of available data and data gaps, 2. A coding error in their spreadsheet, and 3. An unconventional weighting of summary statistics. The chart on the right shows what happens when you implement Herndon, Ash, and Pollan's corrections. The changes to the GDP growth rates after correction are modest in the first 3 debt-to-GDP level categories and huge in the 90 or above category, meaning that the paper vastly overstated the effect of high debt on GDP growth rates. Over on the left is the spreadsheet coding error they found. The average should be taken from row 30 to row 49, but here it stopped at row 44, meaning it omitted Belgium, a counterexample from the analysis. You might have noticed that these examples have come from the fields of psychology, political science, and economics. Perhaps you're wondering if replication problems only occur in those fields, but not in fields like chemistry and physics. Thinking this would be a mistake. Here is a very recent example that was detailed in an article titled "The War Over Supercooled Water in Physics Today." In this example, 2 different chemists ran simulations to see what happens when water is supercooled to around minus 40 degrees centigrade, where it is known to spontaneously freeze even if it is free of impurities. One of the simulations found that water morphed back and forth between a water-like form and an ice-like form. The other chemist, who was very famous in this field, only found the water-like form. But based on the details of their simulations, they should have gotten the same result. This set off a chain of events where, over the next 7 years, the perplexing discrepancy would ignite a bitter conflict, with junior scientists caught in the crossfire. At stake were not only the reputations of the 2 groups, but also a peculiar theory that sought to explain some of water's deepest and most enduring mysteries. Earlier this year, the dispute was finally settled, and as it turns out, the entire ordeal was the result of botched code. These examples illustrate many ideas. On one hand, The scientific method does seem to work properly if we give it enough time. However, that doesn't mean there aren't consequences to not taking better care to ensure reproducibility. Think about how much time and energy was spent trying to replicate certain results that were the result of coding errors or fraud. If these papers had been required to include all code and data related to their analysis as part of publication, these problems might have been found out sooner. They might even have been found during peer review. It is for this reason we will adopt a set of tools and specific practices during this class as a way to encourage and train future scientists to consider reproducible research as the default mode for note-taking and data analysis. We will now turn to discussing the tools that we will use.